Fundamentally, people talk about how everybody fights the last war, and they're always, thinking the next war will go like the last war, but the next war is often different because people learn from the last war. They adapted, things have changed, tactics have changed, right? It's not the same move doesn't give you the same result. And a lot of big wars actually happen after, for example, Crimea in 2014, when Putin invaded Crimea in Ukraine, he had no resistance. He just took it over. For the next 7 years, Lindsey Graham and John McCain, lots of Americans went and armed the Ukrainians. And, there was a lot of low-level conflicts between Ukrainians and Russians. And then Putin's like, okay, let me invade again in 2022. And he called the special military operation. He probably thought it would be as easy as what he did in 2014. And it's this giant, massive, insane war on the border of Europe, which is basically Russia versus NATO. And, in the first few months of that, we didn't know if it was going to go nuclear or what have you. And it settled into this crazy, bloody drone war that's been going on for 4 years now, right? And so another example of that, 1993, the World Trade Center bombings in 1993 were, something that didn't take down the World Trade Center, but it was in the basement. Then 8 years later, the 9/11 attacks on the same World Trade Center actually did blow up the whole thing and had, a million X more ramifications. And so, this also happened at the beginning of World War II, where Hitler took various kinds of territory, and then, nothing happened. And then, bang, a lot of the shooting started. Okay. And so what we have here is something where, due to the 12-day war last year, due to the Venezuela capture, MAGAs just radically overstated their strength. And they thought, oh, well, we came in as anti-war. Maybe we can just win all these wars. Remember, we're more powerful than we thought. And they just basically did this huge gamble. And now everybody's in a huge pile. And just to go through this post for a second, if you go to the top, right? So basically, this war, and we're talking on March 20th, 2026. Okay, things can change. Wars move really, really quickly. All kinds of alliances can form, and so on and so forth. But as of right this moment, quite a lot of oil infrastructure has been blown up in the Middle East, including things that would take years to come back online. Some of the Qatar, oil fields that Qatar and Iran share. And these are things which are upstream of the entire world economy. This is what one might call the Abrahamic artery of the world, right? The entire oil era, the post-war era, which is based on American control of the Middle East and oil and so on and so forth. It literally might come to an end if Iran and Israel just don't want to make peace with each other. And even if the U.S. withdraws, they both think it's existential, because Iran backed the militias, Hamas, Houthis, Hezbollah, that did October 7th, and Israel thinks it's existential for them. And Iran thinks that Israel wants to push it into a Syria, Libya civil war kind of state, which they might, and they think it's existential for them. So also, these are both very smart people. They've been around for thousands of years. They know each other really well. The Americans are just dumb interlopers in a sense, and they just don't have any, war is a way of teaching Americans geography, if you've heard that before. There's that study which shows people trying to find Iran on a map, and Americans just literally don't know where it is. They can't pinpoint it on a map, right? And they didn't need to know that, right? But the problem is, to get in this giant war, even if, what could happen? Trump could withdraw, right? What happens then? Iran and Israel will still be going at it. Iran has said that they simply don't want to, they don't want to be attacked in the same way again. So what are they going to do? They're going to actually try to reshape the Middle East to be greater Iran. And they're firing missiles at people until they shut down their U.S. military bases and expel their ambassadors. And they can cause massive asymmetric damage. And if those countries hit back, well, they'll just get more Iranian missiles. Basically, Iran is just set up for a long war, because they think that if they let this go, they've just tolerated too much. They've now said, okay, we're just going to go all the way. The big difference is that very few countries could withstand this level of punishment, right? The assassination of their top leader and all of these, top officials, and thousands and thousands of sorties and just keep firing like they've been doing, right? They built these missile cities. They've been preparing for this war for 20 years. I think maybe China could have taken a beating like this, maybe Russia, but even Russia is a maybe, because if you like who's under Putin? Do they have a bench that's that deep, right? One way of thinking about it is you couldn't assassinate, but let me use a different term. Let's say that a number of prominent people in Catholicism step down. That wouldn't end Catholicism, right? Let's say a bunch of prominent Democrats step down. That wouldn't end wokeness. Or a bunch of Bitcoin nodes were shut down. It wouldn't end Bitcoin. They're fundamentally decentralized. And the Iranian regime is decentralized in that way, where there's an ideology that the people share. And it's like, it's a religious ideology, right? And it's a religious/nationalist ideology. It's very different than Venezuela, where a lot of these new world countries, with perhaps the exception of Brazil and Mexico, are just really lines on a map, right? They don't have hundreds, let alone thousands of years of history and culture. Like, there's no genetic test you can do to localize someone to Venezuela, but there is to localize someone to Persia, right? To Iran. That's like an old world country, It's like a pre-1492 country. It's a it's like multi-thousand. It's like one of the things about it, by the way, is many Americans, they're just shocked that Iran is putting up such a fight, because they think of Iran, like this third world. And often they think of it as like this sand dune kind of thing where guys in caves, like, Osama bin Laden and so on and so forth. It's not like that, actually, or at least certainly it's not all like that. If you see videos of Tehran before AI and so on and so forth, you want to look pre-2022 for timestamp things if you want that. A lot of it looks very modern, right? They have glass countertops and, there's greenery and trees and stuff. Iran is not what people think it is. It's actually a very sophisticated, it's got obviously like its internet blockade and so on and so forth, but they managed to do a lot under decades of sanctions. They have actually, what's funny about this is many in MAGA think that tariffs are to their advantage, right? To set up a wall around the world and build everything yourself. So sanctions sort of forced, it's as if the Iranians were imposing tariffs on themselves. That's one way of thinking about it, okay? So obviously, the sanctions, caused them a lot of problems. Nevertheless, they built up all of this industry domestically. The point being that as of this particular conversation, it looks like the Iranians have either shot down or damaged an F-35, multiple F-35s, shot down multiple U.S. aircraft, blown up a lot of U.S. military bases to the point that Planet Labs has held back satellite imagery, maintained their command and control despite the assassinations of multiple top leaders, managed to essentially just like say they were going to shoot something and then shoot it hours later. And, it's not easy to do that, right? Like, because they have to have these hidden missile launchers. They have to have, there's a lot of stuff that goes into maintaining something like this, the mosaic defense. So they have punched way above their perceived weight. And you could sense amazement, exasperation, frustration from Hegseth and Kane, on the Pentagon side, where, raising Kane, he said something like, they're putting up a fight. I'll give them that, right? And then like on the first few days, like Hegseth said, it's not a fair fight. We're going to punch them when they're down and rain death and destruction. Like, we have total air dominance. That is not what's happening, actually. That's not what's happening at all. The missile launchers are being exhausted. Not what's happening. They're increasing their missile attacks and drone attacks. It seems like they used their low-quality missiles in the first few days to exhaust all the interceptors, and now they're launching better missiles, right? Iran learned, the thing that people aren't realizing is, Iraq is next door to their west, and Afghanistan is to their east, and they basically sponsored insurgencies there to drive out the Americans. So they have been fighting the Americans through proxy for decades. They know all kinds of stuff about the Americans, right? Like, they're basically 2-0 if you count Iraq and Afghanistan, and maybe 3-0 if you count the Houthis. That's the other thing. In 2023, after October 7th, the Houthis went and blocked the Red Sea. And the U.S. Navy, there's this whole article about how, under both Biden, Operation Prosperity Guardian, and Trump, they tried to dislodge them, and they couldn't win militarily. It just didn't work, right? And you can look at Suez traffic and it's just permanently down. Everybody just routes around the Cape of Good Hope instead. And that's because there was an alternative to Suez, which was the Cape of Good Hope, meaning they have to go all the way around South Africa to ship up to Europe as opposed to going through the Suez Canal. And what happened was it just became economically infeasible and people rerouted. But there isn't an obvious alternative to the Strait of Hormuz for a lot of things. Okay, fine. Plus, they're actually blowing up the oil infrastructure. Point being, Iran is a lot stronger than people think. It's a lot smarter than people think. For example, like Iranians are often top 10 in the math Olympiads every year, right? Like, there's a reason. Like, Israel is a very, very smart country. They punch way above their weight on all kinds of numbers, from startups to Unit 8200 and so on and so forth. But the Iranians are also. That's actually why Iran has given Israel so many problems, because they're both really smart and they go back thousands of years, and until you kind of see it that way, as like, it's kind of like Russian versus German in Stalingrad, these are actually, and the thing about it is, when in the diaspora, I know many Israelis, Jews, Persians, Shiite Muslims who get along great, right? I work with all these people in tech. They're great people, right? And they don't fight when they're outside the Holy Land for the most part, like not to be kumbaya about it, but within tech, Persians, Jews, Christians, Hindus, Muslims, we can all get along and just build business together. And the competition between businesses is at a virtualized level, right? So I know that it is possible for that to be there. And I have great respect for the Israelis and actually the Persians, as people. And this is this extremely unfortunate situation where they are both pitted against each other in what they think of as a life and death thing. Also, one other thing is that within Iran, the religious side is almost like the religious right, and the secular side is almost like the secular left, to roughly map it to the West. It's not exactly right, but it's close. And with the bombings, a lot of the people who are protesting have had a rally behind the flag effect. It's complicated. There's many different factions and so on. And, you talk to people in the Persian diaspora, they'll have different opinions. But I think many of them thought that, this is going to be some surgical thing like the Venezuela thing. But it didn't turn out like that. It's not turning out like that. And in fact, it's turning into like a total pummeling of lots of civilian infrastructure within Iran. And so now they're realizing, actually, this could turn into something like Libya or Syria, where just the country just got shattered into shards in civil war. And they want off this train, right? But, the thing about it is, like, one of the problems with the diaspora, with the Free French during World War II, they actually built a military and they joined the Allies and they actually fought to retake France. They were only outside for like a year or two and they thought of themselves as the government in exile and so on and so forth. Now, with Chiang Kai-shek, when he got pushed into Taiwan, he kind of wanted to take back the mainland, but he couldn't. And so we've had this frozen civil war for 80 years. That's like Taiwan, China, right? And so this is a common paradigm that happens within countries where there's like an alienated diaspora, like the Cuban diaspora hates Cuba for good reason. They're communists and so on. And lots of the Persians who've left are really smart, hardworking, capitalist people who, despise this kind of religious fundamentalist regime. And I'm very sympathetic to that. With that said, surgery is not butchery. Like, if you want to just excise, the bad guys, that's one thing, right? It's amazing, this Maduro thing, that was actually genuinely amazing that was even possible, right? But it's not always possible to do it. Sometimes the cancer is not benign and you can't just cut it out with one snip. It's malignant, it's spread through the whole thing. It's decentralized. So if that's what the Iranian regime is, what next, right? I mean, look, sometimes great people are taken over by, like the Russians have many, many smart people, and they were taken over by Soviet communism. The Chinese, many smart people, they were taken over by Maoism. India had many smart people, it was taken over by socialism, right? And so great people can sometimes go crazy. And then, what's kind of happened recently, which is interesting, is, the Chinese, what they did is they did, communism with Chinese characteristics. So they kind of turned communism into, like, they did a fusion of this sort of alien ideological imposition, which came from the West, by the way, right? Communism was not domestic to China. They did a fusion of that with their domestic, Chinese traditions. And now, the party presents itself as basically the Mandarin system reincarnated, right? And it's like 5,000 years. They claim continuity with 5,000 years of Chinese history and so on and so forth. The Iranian regime has actually started to do that, like fundamentalism with Persian characteristics. The difference is that so there's like a Financial Times article on this, for example, from last year, where they started to basically try to embrace more of the Persian heritage, because it'd always been at odds, right? Like Islamic fundamentalism versus Persian nationalism is roughly like Chinese communism versus Chinese nationalism. You have an internationalist ideology, and then you have a nationalist ideology, and they fight each other, for control of the same minds, right? And then sometimes there's a synthesis of that, which is like today's Chinese communism. And the Iranian regime has started to tap into Persian nationalism. It's similar to like what Stalin did, where there was like, during World War II, it wasn't just for communism. He called it the Great Patriotic War. He tapped into Russian nationalism and said, we're fighting for Mother Russia, and so on and so forth, right? Okay. Now, the thing about that is the big difference between Iran versus China is China's no longer in ideological spread mode. They just think their system works for them. They just want to be closed from the whole world. If Vietnam wants to copy it, great. But everybody else just do whatever they want. They're not in like the Maoist era of trying to export their system ideologically. They may implicitly export it when they export software that they can remote turn off, but they're not trying to export it ideologically. By contrast, fundamentalism with Persian characteristics is built for export, right? They do want to evangelize. They want to have all these proxies around. They want to flip the Middle East to Greater Iran. And in some sense, like, this war may have given them the opportunity to do that. It is one possible outcome. And of course, we're very early days right now. One of the biggest issues is the presence of a U.S. military base in a country used to mean that country had arrived. That country was on the map. The Pentagon's on our side. The Americans are with us. They're going to invest in our country. Our kids can go to U.S. universities. The U.S. is never going to invade us. We're going to get access to U.S. stocks. And there's going to be U.S. tourists. Amazing. Our country is doing great now, right? So lots of countries sought out to become a place for a U.S. military base, right? Because of the injection of money and the injection of protection. They didn't have to spend as much on defense. They could allocate that to healthcare or, whatever else, right? So it's this huge money saver where they outsource their security to the Americans in return for a military base. For many years, that was a good deal for many people. With Ukraine, that started to tip negative, and now it's tipped very sharply negative, where, to their shock, the Kuwaitis, the Saudis, the guys in Bahrain and Qatar and so on and so forth, they've all had these U.S. military bases. And for a long time, nobody would mess with them directly because the U.S. military is there. But Iran has strengthened itself enough, and that's what people don't understand. Like, if you look at our world in data, you look at electricity production, Iran has more electricity than Britain now. It had much less in the 80s when it was, quote, third world developing. It has more now, right? So many graphs are like that. It's got a domestic thing for many different things, satellites, all kinds of stuff it's got domestically. I may have, there's a list, there's a tweet which shows all the stuff that they've built domestically. Obviously, they're close to nukes or whatever, it's been talked about forever. But obviously, their Shaheds, their one-way drones are something the Americans had to copy for their Lucas drone, right? So the point being that all of these countries that had outsourced their military to the U.S. suddenly found that rather than it saving them money, it's costing them enormous amounts. But it's all being paid at once, where having a U.S. military base there means it's worth like negative $100 billion because they're now targets for the Iranians, A, and the Americans can't and or won't defend them, right? That's to say they're not giving them the anti-missile defense. Maybe they don't even have enough. They can't make enough, Patriots or what have you, because the Shaheds are like 1/1000th the cost. This was the same thing that we saw with the Houthis in the Red Sea. There's a political article on it from years ago that I posted years ago, a $2,000 drone versus a $2 million missile. Obviously, what that means is the Pentagon's budget is like $1 trillion, right? But if your attacker has 1/1000th the cost differential, for $1 billion, you can take on $1 trillion, right? Which means that the Pentagon's budget, if it's divided into the cost of things, and if they're that expensive, or conversely, a low budget divided into something that's very cheap, the Iranians could actually do much more with much less than people realize. Okay, so it's a much more equally matched thing than it would seem just when matching dollar to dollar. Okay, so point being that all of these countries that had U.S. military bases now see it go sharply negative, and they see the U.S. can't protect them. And there's this whole joint statement by like basically all the countries bordering Iran to like stop shooting at them. It included Pakistan, by the way. Pakistan, Turkey, Azerbaijan, all these countries basically said, Iran, stop shooting at us, which is totally reasonable because they felt they're not combatants. But the reason Iran is shooting at them is they want them to say, I'm going to like shut down the U.S. military base in my soil. I'm going to stop letting my soil be used for missile attacks. And there's credible, or like Wall Street Journal recently reported that it does appear that the U.S. is using their soil for missile attacks on Iran. So it's the reason Iran is shooting missiles at them is Iran is aware that some of the missiles and things that are hitting Iran are coming from that soil. Okay. And they also think those bases are being used for intelligence and so on, right? So the Iranian demand is for these countries to shut down their U.S. military bases, expel their ambassadors, and so on and so forth. The thing is, every other country around the world is also seeing this. The U.S. military has like 750 military bases worldwide. And they're all realizing, so the son of the Australian Prime Minister, Turnbull, just published an article where he had realized what everybody else had realized, which is that a U.S. military base is now a liability, not an asset. Like the U.S. basically wants you to die first, your country to get blown up first. It's not going to protect you. You're going to become a target. It can be hit with missiles. Every other adversary around the world has seen how easily it can be hit by missiles, and it can be blown up because technology is advanced. So all these above ground U.S. military bases are now sitting ducks. The Americans can't or won't protect. And for example, they withdrew their THAAD radar from South Korea and packed it up and are sending it to the Middle East. First, that shows that the Iranians blew up a THAAD, THAAD. Second, this is very expensive installation. Second, it really pissed off South Korea because South Korea, when this THAAD had been installed there in 2016 and 2018, paid this huge price where China had pulled all of this money from them because it said, South Korea is allowing itself to be used as a staging base. So South Korea is in a lose-lose where it paid this huge economic price 10 years ago when those THAADs were installed. And now they're just getting shipped away because America doesn't actually care about that region of the world. And it's a lose-lose-lose because the next day, Kim Jong-un went out and fired off some cruise missiles, showing that he knows that their defenses are now down and their big patron has actually refocused on the Middle East. Okay. So what this means is many countries are realizing what kind of Ukraine realized, but now the Gulf states are realizing is that the U.S. military is not going to be there for you. It's not going to defend you because MAGAs, but like America feels deeply, it's very schizo right now, but it feels that it's in decline and will sometimes admit it's in decline, but only when a Republican is accusing the Democrat of causing decline or Democrats accusing the Republican of causing decline. They don't want to admit they're in a secular decline due to the fact that 1950 was like peak America. You can put that graph on screen take that graph. Let me just anchor this and I'll come back. Can you go to the other post? The Zion is wrong, China is strong. That one, yeah. And just scroll down. All right, yeah, okay, so this is maybe the most important graph in the world, where it shows the center of the world economy, center of mass, used to be in the center of Eurasia for much of history. Basically, if you average the Japanese and the Chinese economies, Indian economies, Middle Eastern, European, with whatever estimates you have for the locations of the capitals and so on, and there's a study there that does those estimates, you get something where roughly there was military economic parity across Eurasia. And that's why like the Huns and Mongols could invade Europe and the Arabs could take Andalusia and Marco Polo sought out China and Columbus risked his life to get to India. That's because there were economic centers there of note. With the Industrial Revolution, Europe got way in the lead. And so it was the first Renaissance in the Industrial Revolution. And by 1913, 1940, they all blew each other up in World War I, World War II. And then by 1950, the world economy was basically between Western Europe and America, right? And because the globe is a globe, that's why it's located in that kind of weird area. If you kind of average everything together, you get something like that. But the point being that is the most unusual time in human history. That is peak America, peak Westernization, also peak centralization, the century of mass media, mass production, and so on. With the invention of the transistor, everything started going backwards. And also with the defeat of communism in 1991, everything really accelerated. Why? Russia became capitalist, Eastern Europe became capitalist, China accelerated its liberalization, India began its liberalization. The internet actually, NSF repealed its acceptable use policy, and that allowed for capitalism on the internet. And so what that meant was the world economy recentered very quickly in Asia, moved back much faster than it came, because the first part took thousands of years, the next part was hundreds of years, and the last part was just tens of years. It happened within our lifetime, okay? So what that means is that like MAGA, in the sense of Make America Great Again, is literally infeasible, because it's asking to rewind this clock, which is the trajectory of billions of people across and trillions of dollars across 1,000 years. Okay, so if you hit X on this graph and just scroll down, I'll show a few more. Go down, down, down. Keep going. Go to the next one. Click that one. Okay, this shows the G7, which is the group of 7 countries. That's the US, UK, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan, right? So yeah, UK, Canada, I may have missed one, but that's basically it, right? So that group is just in decline relative to the BRICS, of which really it's China, India, Russia, and then to a lesser extent Brazil, right? South Africa is not really material in it. The BRICS countries have just been growing, right? And this is the GDP at PPP, purchasing power parity, right? Where you're actually normalizing for the fact that things are cheaper in those countries, okay? So this shows that actually, like, the entire West is in secular decline. How could it be otherwise? Because it was at peak Westernization, it was at total, completely ahistorical levels of dominance, right? We're just returning, in a sense, to historical normal. If you go to the next graph, so that is 2023, 3 years ago. Russia, which people thought was a gas station with nukes and so on, even the World Bank said, actually, it's number 4 globally GDP PPP, right? So it's the RIC of BRICS are number 4, number 3, and number 1. So these are civilization states that are actually doing very well, right? And if we hit X out of this, scroll down. So this is a graph I'm sure maybe your viewership has seen, but this is an estimate of like the past economic weight of China and India. Why were they able to maintain these giant populations? Obviously, they had very developed economies. You wouldn't be able to maintain a giant population for such a long period of time unless something was working for you, right? Like there's some civilizational kind of thing that allowed people to get along. Roughly speaking, China's secret weapon is centralization and India's is decentralization. Very, very roughly, to simplify, right? And so if you hit X going out of that, okay, so this is like an example. If you click that, that's actually a relatively rare example. Not relative, it's like, the thing is Americans will deny they're in decline, Republicans will deny it, and I'll post Trump's video, a nation in decline. They're like, okay, but Trump is fixing it. Okay, fine. But like, is it in decline or not, right? And so each side wants to blame it on the other, but actually it's a secular thing. It's something which is, it's like declining from the all-time peak. How could it be otherwise? How could you increase your dominance from the 1950 peak where everybody else was bombed out and so on and so forth, right? The only way you could return to that is with, unfortunately, a strategy of lighting the rest of the world on fire and retreating to North America, right? Which is kind of the strategy of American anarchy, Trashcanistan, whatever you want to call it. It's like blowing up lots of countries, pushing them to civil war, pushing them to fighting into war with their neighbors, and then saying, it's your problem, you deal with it, and then flying back home, right? And, this is unfortunately like the more or less explicit strategy that some people seem to advocate on Twitter or in books and so on and so forth, which is screw the rest of the world. And, we tried to help them. It didn't work out. We're going back home after blowing up the whole thing. Right. And, for example, you're seeing that now, like, oh, it's just the Europeans' problem. The Strait of Hormuz is blocked. Why don't they go and figure it out after a giant war has been started? You know what I mean? Right. So if you hit X, just to escape out of that, scroll down. Right. So now what are the underlying drivers of decline? The first driver is that the Republicans were disrupted by China. By Republicans, I mean manufacturing and military. And the second, if you actually, you can just hit right arrow. If you click the right arrow on the side, this shows that the Democrats were disrupted by the internet. And I identified the Republicans with manufacturing and military and the Democrats with media and money, okay? So you can see that in this graph, for example, newspaper revenues peak at $67 billion in the year 2000. And then Google and Facebook just go vertical right after the financial crisis, right? So what happened was Democrats, Republicans were sitting pretty and strong up until the 90s, 2000s. And they both suddenly became economically seriously disrupted in the years after the financial crisis. And so this led, the disruption by the internet pushed Democrats to do wokeness versus Trump and the techlash versus the tech guys. And disruption by China is what pushed Republicans to elect Trump to go after Democrats and to do the trade war versus China. And so once you realize that it's actually four factions, China, Republicans, Democrats, and the internet, and China disrupted the Republicans and the internet disrupted Democrats, then you can kind of see the topology of the world. Are you with me so far?
Right? Yep. Okay. I have many questions, but I'll let you complete.
Okay. So once you have this whole worldview, the disruption of the Republicans by China and the Democrats by the internet has shrunk their pies and made them more radicalized. And they keep trying more and more radical political things, swinging from left to right to further to the left to further to the right, thinking that there's some way of voting their way out of this or changing their own government, which is a little bit like thinking that the solution to the Soviet Union was going to be found between Gorbachev and the hardliners or something like that. But sometimes the solution doesn't lie within the system, but outside the system. They have a mental model of the pendulum swinging and returning back to an equilibrium. But a different mental model is that of Galloping Gertie, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, where it swung from left to right and then farther to the left and farther to the right till the bridge just crashed into pieces and fell into the ocean. And that's what is happening in America, where it's certainly not coming back to an equilibrium. It's already splintered into Truth Social and Blue Sky and X and Threads and TikTok. The digital secession is already here. It just remains to be printed out in the physical world. It's very obvious that that's going to happen. The exact mechanism of it, TBD, but there'll be something that happens. And as such, once you realize that it's in decline like this, every party that's in power feels that crunch and they don't want to fail. So what do? They just take crazier and crazier risks to kind of prolong empire. So we forget this now because we survived, but or at least if you're not a Ukrainian or Russian, but the entire Ukraine war was something where there are many ways to have averted that war. For example, if Biden and the Democrat administration and all the NATO guys had gone and actually done a show of force in Ukraine prior to Russia invading, that would have stopped Russia from invading. But instead, what they did is they sent the mixed signals of, we're pulling out of Afghanistan, and they said, people from the embassy get out of Ukraine and so on. And Putin almost got the welcome mat rolled out for him, and he thought the Americans were just going to retreat like they did from Afghanistan. And then it was almost like a bait was set, because after the Russians invaded, then everybody freaked out, and only then did the armaments come in, and then Ukraine was just turned into just a battlefield, right? So the thing is, if you had wanted to actually keep the Russians out, you would have just done a show of force at the beginning, easily could have kept them out. If you'd want to just give it to the Russians, then they could have just surrendered like they did Afghanistan. Instead, they just turned it into this gigantic abattoir of not deterring and also not really sending enough weapons for Ukraine to win, but just for it to bleed the Russians to the last Ukrainian and so on and so forth, and make money on arms sales and make sure the Europeans are also spending all kinds of money and so on and so forth, right? This is not the win-win America of 1945 to 1991. The America of 1945 to 1991, when it allied with West Germany became more prosperous in the bargain, right? The East Germany was poorer, right? West Germany was better. When it allied with South Korea, it became more prosperous than North Korea, right? Taiwan and Hong Kong were more prosperous than mainland China, right? There was a time when allying with America made your country stronger, because it had the right balance of left and right, of capitalism and internationalism and, individualism and so on and so forth. And it has lost that balance where it's just turned Ukraine into like a suicide bomber, right? And the Ukrainians also understand how, it's complicated because I can understand the Russian side, the Ukrainian side, the Estonian side, the European side, the Indian side. Many different people have different vantage points on Ukraine. But really the winners of Ukraine, it actually wasn't Russia either, because Russia became very dependent on China as a consequence of that invasion, right? Now it might be actually winning because oil is going vertical. We'll see what happens. But the winners were those who didn't fight. Like the Polish have a saying, which is when two fight, the third wins. Right? And so when two fight, the third wins, meaning like America in World War II actually did the minimum amount of fighting. That is to say, the Germans and the Russians and the Chinese and the Japanese, actually, those were the major two theaters with most of the killing. And while Americans definitely did fight, they did the minimum amount relative to everybody else, and they took the minimum amount of damage to their homeland, and that's why they were able to get so far. It was only Pearl Harbor and so on. Otherwise, they're basically intact. Everybody else was like zeroed out. In the 20th century, Dalio has a table that shows that only the US, Canada, and Australia made it through the 20th century without going to zero. In Russia, all the money was seized. Germany was bombed to smithereens. Japan was bombed to smithereens. All their compounding was wiped out. The government's wiped out. In some cases, multiple times. Like Germany, like if you lived in a certain part of Germany, you went through like 4 governments, right? You had Weimar Germany, you had Nazi Germany, you had East Germany, and then you had like the German reunification after 1989, right? If you had a long enough life, you lived through all of that stuff, right? Okay. So coming back to this, the issue is that with that decline, the American empire, and one way of modeling it is as a meta-organism. Like an ant doesn't know what it's doing, but the ant colony does. Okay? An individual fish doesn't necessarily know what it's doing, but a school of fish does. Right? It has a higher order. It doesn't mean it's super intelligent. It doesn't mean it's a genius or anything like that. But it means that there's a meta-organism intelligence that is greater than the intelligence of any one organism in the ant colony. Right? So in this, and what that is that's not rather than conspiracy theory, it's colony theory, right? It actually exists. It's conspiracy reality. It exists within nature. You can see it in nature, right? You can even see it within your own body. You've got cells in your body, and those individual cells aren't conscious, but they work together at a collective whole. You can model it as if it was conscious, right? So at the meta-organism level, if you model this as a meta-organism, it is realizing A, it's in decline. The American empire is in decline. B, and here's another really important thing. If you're not growing, you're dying. That's the rule of business. Okay? So some people would say, why not give peace a chance? Why not just have managed decline? Right? Well, Britain tried that. And look at what happened to them. Right? They're in, I mean, there's other factors beside it. But the problem is that there's really no good choices. Maybe you, with really amazing statesmanship, you could work out some power sharing agreement, like a G2 agreement with China. Maybe some alternate universe, they could have done that, right? And that might have worked for a long time. And, nothing is ever permanent, but, it could have lasted maybe decades and so on and so forth. Who knows? Okay. But instead, what they chose to do at the American empire level was roll the dice with these military confrontations, like the military confrontation of, with Ukraine, Russia, and now this giant Iran war. And the thing about that is they, in both cases, radically overestimated American military strength. The thing is, you only have a fight when both sides think they can win. If one side is totally dominant and both sides know that side is totally dominant, the second side doesn't put up a fight, they just capitulate. It's only when they're equally matched, or in fact, one side is stronger and the other side thinks it's weaker, that you have a fight. So the entire concept of Democrats thinking of Russia as a gas station with nukes, or now Republicans thinking of Iran as some, like third world country with sand and what have you, led to a total underestimation of them, right? Conversely, the Russians underestimated the Ukrainians, right? And conversely, the Iranians underestimated the resolve of the Israelis with what they did with October 7th and so on, right? So that's something where there is a mutual underestimation, which just leads to bloody, crazy conflict, right? Okay. So Another way of thinking about this is at the end of the Soviet Union, it imploded, right? Because the Soviets thought, hey, we're going to get capitalism, we're going to get freedom and so on. And actually, that is what the Eastern Europeans and Baltics did get. Overall, net, the end of the Soviet Union was good for them. Arguably, it was net good in the long run for the Russians, but they had 10 years of total misery, penury, deprivation, and so on and so forth, okay? Under Yeltsin, they had hyperinflation, they had crime, the wild 90s is what they called in Russia, right? The end of the USA or the American Empire is going to be much messier than the end of the Soviet Union because it's being denied for so long, right? Like it's already happened. It's already there in the numbers, right? You can see these graphs, right? If you just go graph by graph, this shows that China's completely won the trade war. Like Trump started the trade war in 2017. China's won. Go forward, next graph, right? China's number one in steel. Next graph. They're number one in electricity. They're number one in, go back one actually. Let that video play, right? So it's number one in nuclear plants under construction, number one in rail. China's number one in shipbuilding. They're number one in drones. They're number one in rare earths and critical minerals, in solar, more cement, right? And on, steel, everything, right? So if you go forward one slide, China's actually also getting into planes. C919 is going to compete with Airbus and Boeing. They've already got that in the air. Next one. It's actually flipped the US in open AI models or open weights AI models, right? Next one. And it's signing free trade agreements. The US has left free trade on the ground as a value, and it's gone to tariffs, and China said, thank you very much, and it's picked that up, right? So China's picked up the values like open source and free trade, which you'd think would be the hardest things to copy for their system, right? And this is like, it's quite sad, right? This is actually the most important of all, which shows the US military is made in China. The JDAMs and the Tomahawks, the supplier is Chinese. So China can hold up a hand and shut down the US military. This is a Pentagon study, by the way. $400 million study looking into where the Pentagon supply chains are coming from. Okay.
They didn't realize this during COVID?
They were doing, I don't know, I remember the year they started the study, but Google GOVINI, $400 million Pentagon Chinese supply chain study. Okay, next slide. Yes, go forward one. So China now has the world's largest Navy, by the way, larger than the US Navy. The thing is, this stuff is hyper growth, so it goes very fast, right? If you go to the next one, I mentioned that they have the shipbuilding capacity, but there's also some tweets I embedded. Go forward one more. So the point is they can take over protection of the high seas if they want to. This is a Trashkanistan concept where America basically trashes America's got, the bald eagle is a good metaphor for America because it can fly around the world, bomb something, and then come back to its nest in North America, right? Like when the B-2 bomber takes off from Missouri and goes and blows something up and then comes back, that's a really good metaphor for America. And actually, it's a sequel to how Britain used to operate. Britain was a sea power, right? Everybody else in Europe was really a land power. France was kind of half sea, half land, right? But Britain, because of a big island, was a sea power. And as such, it thought of the Navy as its main thing. And so it did these hit and run tactics. It could just bang, hit you from on the ocean. It also thought global because when you're on the ocean, you can go port to port, right? That's why Japan also was a power in the East because it's also a sea power, because it's this giant island, right? And whereas Germany or Russia, those are land powers, right? They're like kind of born on the land. America is a sequel to Britain, and it's an air power. Some people say aerospace republic or something, right? And so the tactic of just flying from your nest, blowing something up and then coming back worked for a long time, but in the Middle East, it just failed. And the reason it failed is the bald eagle left all these eggs on the ground because there's on the order of 1 million Americans in the Middle East, in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, but also in Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and many of the Gulf states. There's not just on the order of 1 million Americans, there's like hundreds of billions of dollars, trillions of dollars in US capital investment that is directly or indirectly tied to all of those Gulf countries, right? All of them putting in money, right? And so all of that is now gone. because these Gulf countries need to husband cash. They're getting hit like they never got hit before, right? So all the money that they put into data centers, AI chips, that's like growth, that's the future and so on. They're coming all the way back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like survive, food, energy, right? Like they're just coming all the way back to that from up over here. Okay.
Yeah, those are the points you made on the other post.
That's the points I made in the other post. That's right. So the thing is that, people talk about Iran fighting an asymmetric war against America, but this is the first symmetric war America's fought in modern history, where American assets are in missile range. American data centers are getting hit by Iranian missiles. Oil fields that have American interests, like Exxon's, like stake in this giant, oil field just got incinerated, right? American VCs, their LPs are in the Middle East. American tech companies are there, right? Americans themselves are there, right? So this is something where Americans are in missile range and American interests are in missile range. And it's a symmetric war because Iran is able to take out American aircraft and it is able to blow up American bases. It is like actually something which is the first symmetric war in basically modern American history, where America is actually taking serious economic damage back, and it isn't prepared for that. Whereas Iran, for the last 40 years, went through the Iran-Iraq War. It had the Gulf War on its doorstep. It had ISIS on its doorstep, and it's Saddam first, and then ISIS. It had Afghanistan war on its doorstep. Iran is built for war. It's just been doing war for 40-something years. It's got a wartime economy. It's got an autarkic economy. The whole thing is set up for a long war. Everybody's born to war. So they're just ready. They know that they beat the Americans because the Americans were there for, 20 years in Afghanistan, eventually gave up. And it's not like 92 million Iranians are going to go anywhere. They have home court advantage. They've been there for whatever 1,000 years. They know every nook and cranny of every mountain. They've spent decades fortifying everything. I mean, it's obvious that that's not going to be an easy win, right? Like, duh. So this kind of doctrine over here, the trash Canison doctrine, is not actually as appropriate here because a lot of American interests are going up in smoke from this as well, right? If we hit ESC out of this and just let's go back to my original post then. The reason I wanted to give all this context is unless you really understand that America is in decline and it's lashing out when it's in decline, and that lashing out is not partisan exactly, it takes a form of a left form or a right form, but it is really something that, it was true even during 2022. You could see it when the Biden administration was doing everything it could to try to put China in a box with sanctions. And, it was when the left does it, they're more subtle about it. They use the language of human rights and allies and so on and so forth, right? But I mean, the Biden administration was at simultaneous war with Trump, tech, Russia, China, and they were alienating Israel. And they're in fights with a lot of people at once, right? The Trump administration has actually increased that, where they're fighting even the Canadians and Greenland, right? They're riven internally. They're fighting the Democrats. Part of it is also that, as the U.S. has declined, its IQ has declined. For example, there's, if you go to, I'll send you a link. You can put this on screen. If you look at the reading level of American speeches, okay, it is just fallen off a cliff. And as a consequence, it's not your imagination. It is becoming idiocratic. The discourse is literally becoming dumber, right? And hold on, let me find this.
What is very interesting is that in the age of technology, it's just that the rise and fall of economies and empires is
fast.
I think, sped up.
Yes.
Here we go. I remember. All right. You sent it to me?
Go ahead. Yes, I'm sending you something. 1 second.
All right. All right. Got it. Here we go.
I'm really live. Sheesh. Okay. All right. So yes, so scroll down. Click that first graph.
Cool.
Okay. So that shows that for a few hundred years, the reading level of speeches has been in decline because it's gotten more and more and more populist. And the IQ level is basically dropped, right? But what's interesting is and this is Democrat and Republican, by the way, right? But as Democrat and Republican IQ has dropped, what's increased? If you go forward one, Chinese robots, and then one more, AI IQ. So China and the internet are the successors to the Democrats and Republicans, where China disrupts the Republicans, the internet disrupts the Democrats. Many Indians will be on the internet. And so the internet includes everybody, but it includes Indians too, right? It includes Chinese people as well. And so roughly speaking, that's like the new two poles in the world after American Empire, China and the internet. And the Chinese one is obvious. The internet one is interesting because it's not obvious. One way of thinking about it is the internet is the only thing that has the economic scale comparable to China. When I say scale, I mean like just what the number of widgets that China churns out is beyond imagination unless you've actually seen it, right? They have like whole cities for hairdryers. In a sense, if you look around your apartment or something like that and you had X-ray goggles and you said, what pieces of here are made in China? Just about everything in the physical world is made within one or two steps of China. It's a make everything thing. I'm not saying other countries don't make something. India's actually doing quite well with smartphones and so on. It's amazing, actually. India, on many graphs, is a distant but real number two. And that's an important thing. It's distant. It's not going to catch up to China, but real because it is a real number two. And I'll come to that. But the thing is that to first order, everything physical is Chinese. Everything digital really is the internet. And we don't think of the internet as a first-class actor, yet at the same time, it's where all actors are. Like this war is being waged on social media, right? Like the measures of success are price graphs and social media posts and drones and, all this kind of stuff, right? So in many ways, the Iranians are fighting an economic war as much as they're fighting anything else, right? But anyway, point is, if you go back 2 slides, just to pull it together, US IQ reading level is in decline, right? As the US power is in relative decline, as US debt is in radical ascent. I don't even need to show that graph, but you just can imagine it, okay? And yet the US is very heavily armed. So it's getting like less powerful relatively, lower IQ, more in debt, but it's very heavily armed. That is a recipe for bad things. That's what's happening now. And it's unfortunate for all kinds of reasons because, one of the problems is you can't actually show the reality of how much better non-Western places have gotten without some MAGA or, sometimes a woke saying, oh my God, you're a shill for this, that, or other country, right? Like, for example, if someone talked about how clean Russian subways are, they're like, oh, you're a Vatnik, you're like a Russian agent or a sleeper agent, right? Or if they said, actually, Chinese cities, have been built, they say, oh, what, they just put LEDs on their cities, you're a China shill, right? They'll say this stuff because it offends their ego to think that something could possibly be better than America. And because they're so identified with it being the best, but they don't actually want to do what's necessary to remain the best, which is actually, the Andy Grove thing, only the paranoid survive, right? When America was becoming the best, it didn't constantly say, oh, the Soviet Union sucks and so on and so forth. Instead, it took the Soviet Union incredibly seriously. It said, this is a country that did Sputnik. This is a country that has taken over so much territory. They thought of the Russians, the Soviets as an enemy, but they had respect for them. It's like respect in the sense of like a worthy adversary, right? As somebody who, you're not just going to go into a chess match without preparing and thinking that the other guy has a really low ELO rating. Do you know what I mean? Right. Also, the guys who built American empire were just much more judicious. Like, you're not supposed to go and shoot everybody all the time. You're supposed to, most of the time, use diplomacy. I'm not saying that they didn't use war when they felt they had to use war, but much of the American empire's diplomatic agreements with hundreds of countries, or not actually hundreds, there's about 200 countries, let's say close to 200 countries around the world, and almost all of them have signed some diplomatic agreement. Like the UN is based in the US, and like the financial system is based in the US. Like even Alibaba in the 2010s went public in the US. Like Russians and Iranians, Chinese, they sent their elites to get educated in the US, and so on and so forth, or the West. And so the issue is that the whole world was set up with American empire as the hub. And now that hub has had a radical drop-off in IQ, a drop-off in dominance, and it's taking every contractual and implicit relationship that it has, and it's just burning them for what it can get out of that, right? So to trust that the U.S. is going to be there for you when it's like abandoned the Gulf states to their fate, like the military base pullout, right? When it's basically saying, Japan, you should pay for yourself. When it's telling, the Canadians it's going to invade Canada, the Greenlanders, right? Like, it's literally signaled in 5,000 ways that it's only out for itself. And actually, even that is a misnomer, because America as a term is not, it's like saying Soviet, right? What does the Soviet Union include? It includes Russia, it includes Estonia, and so all those broke into separate tribes, right? Or an even better analogy is Korea. Is there Korea? Can we talk about Korean foreign policy? No. We can talk about North Korean policy and South Korean policy, but not Korean policy, right? So you can't really talk about American policy. You can talk about Blue America, Red America, Tech America, and all these sub-tribes within them. But like the United States of America doesn't exist. It's the disunited tribes of North America, right? And that's like so obvious when you look at the data. Something like 4% of Democrats marry Republicans, something like that, right? Like there's this IWF study. That's not, what that means is ideology became biology in one generation, right? That's like a Sunni Shiite level divide. That's a Protestant Catholic level divide. Like they're not mating with each other, right? That's not like the part of the same country anymore. And so the point is that you put all of that together, you've got a bunch of tribes that are only united by one thing, which is like the dollar, that's the one thing. Like Democrats and Republicans, they don't marry each other. They don't vote for each other. They don't talk to each other on social media. The one thing that unites them is literally the economic zone of the dollar. That's it, right? They still trade with each other. They don't talk to, like they buy it at Starbucks and, right, they don't speak to each other. But when that goes, and what is happening now in the Middle East is going to blow up the petrodollar. When that goes, all the ties break apart, right? Now, actually, I can go into that if you want me to, explain.
Sure. Now, I just had a question over here now, so that you can maybe explain this. The slides that you showed about how China is replacing America in many other areas. In that one, there was one particular slide where about the $400 billion study, where the Americans are relying on Chinese companies. But
yes.
What if I was to flip it around and ask you the question? There might be many Chinese companies that are also reliant on American companies. Now, the best example of that would be how the Chinese now finally decided to not let NVIDIA chips be part of it.
Sure. Yeah,
right.
That's
so
true,
the reverse would be true or applicable too, right? For the Chinese vis-a-vis America.
But there's a big difference, which is China, it is true, was, and it is to a lesser extent every day, dependent on Americans for some of the high-tech stuff. But on the medium tech and low tech, China totally dominates. So that means is on the essentials, China can screw you on the screws and the nuts and the bolts. You can just hit a button and turn that off, right? And people take those essentials for granted, but they're these low margin, high scale things where, like, think about how many screws you need to make $1 million, right? And yet, if those screws are of low quality, so they have to be fairly high quality screws. If it's a low quality screw, it might only cost a few cents or whatever, but some, car could come apart or something like that, right? So the screws, these kinds of physical things have to be high quality, low cost, massive scale. They're low margin businesses that often have pollution or something like that, industrial accidents that for a variety of reasons, regulation stuff pushed out of America. And the issue with this is basically it is not really, most Americans don't understand that American empire is funded by dollar inflation as global taxation. That is to say, the U.S. prints trillions of dollars and it exports its inflation because other countries hold treasuries, they hold U.S. financial instruments, they hold dollars themselves. Okay, dollar inflation as global taxation means you print $1 trillion, and rather than spreading it across 300 million Americans, you're spreading it across, let's say, 3 billion people in the American Economic Union, which is including the Europeans, the Japanese, but all kinds of people in all kinds of countries that are holding dollars in some way, directly or indirectly, right? Including the Chinese, who hold a lot of, hundreds of billions of dollars in treasuries, okay? They're selling them every day, but they do hold them still. Or at least on the books they hold them. Some people think that they've actually sold them, but they haven't taken them off the books. You can sell a contract without actually having a transfer of an asset. It's like leasing out a house kind of without actually transferring title, okay? So, you could sell a contract to transfer the treasury annuities in perpetuity and, blah, 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 right? Without moving it off your books. Point being, though, that if that contracted, if it went from, let's say, 3 billion people to 300 million, or even 1 billion people to 300 million, if like the domain over which the printing was happening contracted by 60, 70, let alone 90%, that means all of the brunt of the printing is falling on the head of just the 300 million Americans, which means their currency will get destroyed and their living standards will collapse. And how could that happen? Well, let's say you blew up the petrodollar, which is what's happening now. They're blowing up the petrodollar because the entire premise of the petrodollar, starting in the 1970s, 1974, is that Nixon made a deal where he would defend Saudi Arabia with the U.S. military. In return, oil would only be bought in dollars. And that was extended to other Gulf states and so on and so forth. And that's been going on for 50 years. And though there's a thing in the, a few years ago where they declined to renew it or something like that. It's like renewable every 10 years, and Saudi Arabia declined to renew it exclusively. I forget exactly the details of that. It's like 2023. You can look at that. But now the fundamental premise of it, like, what is the US dollar backed by? People would say it's not backed by gold, it's backed by nothing. Actually, it's backed by the US military and by oil, but not anymore. Maybe they're both going to zero, right? And like, why are they both going to zero? Because countries don't want US military protection. The US military bases are negative. And God only knows when we're going to get oil out of the Middle East. Many countries may need to go towards electric, solar, nuclear, coal to chemical, syngas, power to X, all these things where both transportation and other chemicals are switched over to a different model, right? Many countries will have to go nuclear in the sense of having nuclear power and having nuclear weapons and becoming autarkic, because otherwise they won't be able to literally provide for themselves. But if they did go nuclear power plus air plus water, you can actually generate a lot of raw materials and so on and so forth, right? So that's a very important dynamic that this whole thing is kicked off. But it's probably likely many countries will just, like Turkey, will probably just go nuclear. Why? Because they're not going to wait for what happened to Iran. They're not going to wait to be the next guy in the crosshairs and so on and so forth, right? Japan may go nuclear. Brazil may go nuclear, right? Lula has said he doesn't want to be invaded and so on, right? So you're probably going to see some degree of nuclear proliferation happening where anybody who has the ability to do it will do it. So, interesting ones are like Poland or something like that, right? Like in Eastern Europe, they might do it to stop the Russians.
I have a question on the nuclear bit then. I apologize. But considering Canada and its unique space in all of this, listen, I get Canada as another country, but Balaji, you've lived enough in America to understand that Canada and America are literally the same countries. I don't know why Canada is a separate country. I know, the 51st state joke is there, but I think even if Canada was to be overtaken by America, I think most Canadians would be like, I
don't think that's true anymore. I understand what you're saying, but I think what Trump did when he tweeted that he was going to invade Canada, as you know, Pierre Poilievre was in the lead, right? And then he crashed. and Carney won instead. What's interesting is Carney's actually, while he's on the left, he's very high IQ, much smarter than Trudeau, much smarter. And in a sense, Trump's speech when he came down the escalator in 2015, that said America's in decline and China's winning. And Carney's speech in early 2026 was essentially as iconoclastic in a sense, where he said America is over and China's won. And that's what he basically thought. And what he said there was that, essentially he's going to do an alliance with China. He's going to bring in Chinese electric vehicles and the Chinese electric supply chain stack, which is a much bigger deal. Like suddenly he's talking about electrifying, Canada, right? Suddenly he even said something like, if Trump invades Greenland, then, Canada will rise to the defense. With what? With Chinese drones, probably, right? Trump said, we're not going to let Canada become a drop-off point for all the Chinese goods. But of course, it's what's going to happen. Vancouver is going to become a drop-off point for that, right? Like Republicans, somebody noted that they can't even control, what's happening in Missouri, not even happening, can't control what's happening in Minnesota, or who the mayor of New York is. How are they going to control what's happening in Iran, right? Or Canada. And the reason for that is, in many ways, Republicans being so frustrated with the home front are blowing things up abroad because they can do that more unilaterally, or so they thought. Right? It's something where they have such resistance at home. And also the Republican mindset, what they want to do is they want to shoot a bad guy. Okay. They don't want to fight some, 37-something-year-old Democrat woman at home. They wish that the Democrats would just get back together with them and make America again, and can't we all just be American together, and so on and so forth. The Republican, the MAGA, regards the Democrat as sort of like their estranged wife that they want to get back together with. The Democrat regards the Republican as their evil ex-husbands they just want to stay away from forever. And when the Democrats and the Canadians marry Xi instead, then the Republicans will finally feel, oh my God, they're like a different country. Blue America is a different country. They'll get really mad at that point. That's coming. And Canada is the land bridge across the blue American states, because Oregon, Washington, California, the Great Lakes states, and the Northeast all can just drive up into Canada and drive across. There's infrastructure that already connects them, right? So what's likely to happen, depending on how bad this, or actually likely, let's say a scenario that can happen, given how bad all this could get. And they've already signaled this. Newsom's Twitter feed has already signaled this, is that they would just disobey the tariffs and just import all kinds of Chinese stuff to bring prices down because prices have spiked to such an extent. That's the kind of thing which can break the union, because they'd be disobeying federal law and so on. And it'd be exactly the confrontation that happened in Minnesota. But ultimately, if you've got home court advantage, you win. Why? Because it's really hard to play an away game with an invasion or something like that. You need to have a lot of guys to do it. So, there's much more I can say, but let me pause there. It's like a quick brain dump.
Why I mentioned Canada is you're talking about nuclear technology, and that is one country that is a very serious nuclear tech leader in the global economy. Actually, people don't realize that side. They just think Canada is just you drill a hole and you get a bunch of oil, or you get natural gas, but Canada is pretty good in nuclear technology. And
yeah, interesting. Canada could go nuclear. That's interesting.
They have tons of uranium. Probably the highest nuclear deposits in the world. And if Canada goes nuclear, what impact does it have on the United States too, right?
Well, all the threats to invade Canada, the threats to invade Denmark were taken very seriously. They armed up after the whole Greenland thing, right? So essentially, the Europeans and Canadians don't think they're dealing with the normal America anymore, And the thing about it is loyalty is a two-way street. You can't say, oh my God, why aren't the Europeans coming to our rescue after threatening to invade Greenland? Duh. In a sense, Republicans, they just don't get diplomacy, just like Democrats don't get capitalism, right? Democrats just think they've got this powerful state and they can take all the money from everybody and nobody can do anything. And Republicans think they have this powerful state, they can invade everybody and nobody can do anything. And that's true until it isn't, and then they run into resistance. They're so surprised that it happens, and instead you want to play win-win games as much as possible, in my view. But anyway, so it is. There's more I can say. Let me pause there. Why don't we just go through a few more comments and wrap up soon?
Yeah. I'm going to ask you a few questions because they really wanted to ask you this.
Sure.
So somebody had asked me, I wanted to ask Balaji about his prediction that investment in AI will go down as countries rush to invest in energy security. So what do you think? How does it affect Indian IT companies? Because it's an Indian audience, right?
It's hard to. The thing is, it's hard. One thing I can say is a lot of American AI investment and tech investment came from the Middle East recently. We're talking billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars. That's just very obvious. That all goes away. And many other countries that are going to have to allocate money towards suddenly dealing with a shock that they hadn't expected, genuine scarcity, they're going to allocate it towards needs, not wants. How that's going to play out in each sector, it's hard to say, because we're running an oil and energy shock that's never been seen before at a scale that's never been done before, right? You'll probably get, depending on how long the thing goes, you really could have, you could have something like, oil rationing. You could have something like COVID lockdown where people, they don't fly very much or don't drive very much for a while until nuclear comes online, right? A lot of countries will just throw open their doors to China because China's kind of been preparing for energy supply cutoff for a while, coal to chemical, all this kind of stuff. They can scale this up pretty rapidly. They've got a huge stockpile of oil. A lot of the stuff that you hear in the American sector is very enormous cope around China's capabilities. They read these like 10 or 15-year-old, 20-year-old kinds of things. They assume it's the country that it used to be, and they don't understand it's moving at the speed of light. It's moving like, think about how quickly AI is moving. China's moving at that speed, right? So something that's literally 6 months old they may already have addressed that issue. And so it's very possible many countries throw open their doors to just Chinese imports and Chinese electric cars, batteries, all that kind of stuff. I think for Indian IT guys, what do I think? I think just first of all, this is good advice all the time, but it's particularly good advice now. Number one, assume you're never going to raise another financing round again. Get to profitable, right? Or cut your burn and so on and so forth, right? Just don't waste money. Don't assume you're in a fundraising. This is already good advice, but it's really good advice now. Survive. Okay, number one. Number two is figure out what needs are rather than wants. And, for example, people want to find places where they can get inexpensive gas, inexpensive oil, all the supply chain disruptions, researching that and figuring out how India can get more independent and autarkic on that is good. Okay. There's some good things India has been doing on this. They've managed to negotiate passage of tankers. I've been very impressed with some of the things the government's been doing, but it's also a team effort, decentralized effort. I would say trying to get nuclear going faster. There's a ton of plants in India, but just scaling that up rapidly. Ajay Royan of Mithril has Helion, and there's fusion that's now potentially there, right? There's Oklo, which is a small modular reactor. There's a bunch of nuclear stuff. You'll need a mix of things, right? So there's nuclear, there's solar, which actually now is really working. Pakistan has something like 50% of its power is from solar, which is really remarkable, right? Solar has its problems, but it'll work in India. It takes up a lot of space, but you can rack and stack it very quickly, right? And it just hit a tipping point, inflection point in 2025. So solar, nuclear, India has a lot of amazing chemists, right? So, there might be some kind of act that says, copyright generics, just like for generic drugs, right? Whatever patents there are that protect oil chemistry or whatever worldwide, doesn't matter. For national security reasons, we're just going to make our own stuff, right? And I don't know if that, I'd have to get into the details to see, right? But India does have a lot of great chemists. Essentially, what you want to do is you'd want to look at very systematically. I mean, AI will give you a first cut on this, but it'll also give you a bunch of crap, right? very systematically with whatever data source would be the best. Flexport is quite good. It has various tools that look at imports and exports. You need to kind of understand, actually, the systematic thing would be government in India might have the import manifests. You need to understand every disruption, every compound that's being disrupted, make a list of all of those, figure out what are the essential vendors, and then how can you stand up like internal or second source, third source kinds of things for this. Okay. Now, it's a distributed system, so all kinds of individuals are going to be calling up other suppliers around the world. New kinds of sources are going to be coming online. But I think the big thing will be like assuming that the Middle East is going to be offline for some time, right? Another piece of this is going to be OCI. Make the OCI really, really, really easy to use. Right now, the OCI website, getting an OCI is a huge pain, but India should expect. Go ahead.
No, I was just laughing because it is.
There's like something where you have to upload a photo with some crazy dimensions, and it's like what it is like the photo has to be like below a certain size, and you have to like use preview to reduce the file size. It's like, TLDR is like, I found it hard. I was just helping a friend do this. I was like, this is way harder than I expected it to be, right? But optimizing those kinds of things, I think, like there's going to be a lot of people making use of OCI to come back to India, whether it's from America, where there's a lot of anti-Indian sentiment nowadays, unfortunately, or the H-1Bs are getting canceled, or from the UAE and like from the Gulf countries, like people are coming back, for safety for a while, right? For a variety of reasons, OCI is going to be a big thing. That's a government of India thing, but if there's some Indian tech guy who wants to make a better OCI website and just volunteer to give that to the government of India, I'm sure. I shouldn't say I'm sure, but it's possible. That'd be if you did a good job on that and you posted it and it was really good, I would post it and say, hey, look at this, this citizen doing something great, right?
Yeah, I can relate to this because I remember applying for you have to register now before you travel to India, right? And you have to put that website. It was not certain browsers. It was not friendly to certain browsers. So I actually gave that feedback to the Ministry of External Affairs. I'll give you a feedback to the Ministry of External Affairs. This is important. Do you think foundational AI, like on the nuclear bit, just to let you know, in the last budget, the government did intend to make at least 15% of our power generation in the next few years from nuclear power.
That's great.
That's why and I think that's why they're signing a $3 billion agreement with Canada for uranium. And just for information, I think 65% of Indian power is actually from coal, and India has around domestic coal reserves of 400 billion tons approximately.
Yeah. So I think all of that thing is just total pragmatism, right? If coal can actually get you cold chemicals, and they can do a bunch of things, right? So total pragmatism, survival mode. If nuclear solves a problem, if solar solves a problem, if coal solves a problem, if doing this deal or that deal solves a problem. I'm so impressed with modern India. Everybody wants to criticize. But the thing is, India, it is 2 steps forward or 3 steps forward, 1 step back. Yes, there's 1 step back, but on balance, it's improved so far beyond my expectations. What's funny is I think Indians in India take it for granted, and people who are only in the West think it hasn't advanced at all. But if you're back every 3 months, 6 months, you see how much it improves all the time.
Yeah.
It's really, really improving. So anyway, just total pragmatism on, to be clear, this is autarkic out of necessity, not as like, the strategy of like imposing tariffs on yourself or what have you, that's dumb, right? But the strategy of, hey, let's have a second supplier or third supplier for these things coming out of the Middle East, that's now necessary, right? I think one big dimension to this is going to be figuring out how to hyper deflate the cost of almost everything. That's what technology does. Technology reduces prices. So, for example, with housing, you can put together modulars, right? Like just snap, like shipping container style homes, not necessarily literally in a shipping container form factor, but you can build a house for the cost of a car. I think that's going to be a huge trend over the next 10 years, something I'm already working on, investing in, and so on and so forth. Hyper deflation is going to be necessary because essentially what the US government represents is hyper, inflation. Like everything the U.S. government touches, whether it's healthcare, food, education, all increase in price. Now, oil, everything it touches, it just mismanages to such a crazy extent that those prices go to the moon, right? That's now happening with oil, right? Eventually, it's happening with just about everything it touches because it's just so, I don't know, for a combination of things, it manages to boost price in all these areas, a combination of regulation, denial, incompetence, everything, right? So anything that the US government is touching, you should assume is going to fail in some way. So that's another very important piece, right? The US banking system, the US military, any US agreement or contract, because will the Democrats honor it if the Republicans didn't, or vice versa? Who knows, number one. Number two is, will they let your funds get out? No, they've actually already put a remittance tax on there. Look at, for example, the H-1B or green card system, right? All these people were law-abiding. They followed all the rules. They dot every I. They cross every T. And then suddenly you have these really sadistic immigration officers who want, basically to use the regulatory state as a weapon against like an Indian technologist, right? That's not, that's basically something where one way of thinking about it is there's a lot of people on the left who hate capitalists so much that they want the regulatory state to be an inconvenience for them and as a weapon against them and so on and so forth. The point of it is the punishment, right? And so many of the MAGAs just don't want Indians in America at all, right? And so they're going to use the regulatory state against Indians. So fine, you just can't rely on any rules that are written down by Americans. They're just all going to be bent or broken as the country continues to decline, unfortunately, as the empire continues to decline. So another dimension to this is, as you think about the Middle East, think about dependence on the U.S. India wouldn't have broken ties to the U.S., but America pushed it out, right? Like that's say, over the last year or so, India was like integrating with the U.S. in many ways, and then like Trump like gave it a huge shove, right? And the lesson of that was you can only do deals from a position of strength. You have to be able to go it alone. And what Prime Minister Modi did was really smart, where he didn't take the bait and just fight head on. Instead, he went and did deals with everybody in the world, from China and Russia to Canada and Europe, from all the rivals to all the way over here, and just everybody basically did a deal. And he managed a third way. Rather than back down or confront, he just did diplomacy, right? In a sense, by the way, like if, when challenged, every culture often goes back to their like super weapon, the Russian with his sword, like the military, right? The Chinese with their industry to just outwork, grind, right? And the Indians with diplomacy. Deal, negotiate this, that, and the other, right? And just calculating it out and, non-violently, because our culture is really generally non-violent, but intelligently, right? And much of security, much of diplomacy is about, it's actually about, like most security is diplomacy. That's why state and Pentagon work together. You want to, like, the whole point is punch them till they sign. You only hit them till there's a document that you want people to sign. Like World War II, for example. World War II didn't end with the nuking of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You know why?
No clue. I thought it ended because they nuked the shit out of them.
Yes, but it didn't end actually on that day. Go and Google the Japanese signing ceremony. Go to Google Images.
All right.
Put that on screen if you can.
The Japanese signing ceremony. Let me see.
World War II.
All right. Okay. Pulling the images now. Surrender of Japan. Putting the image up for everyone. All right. I didn't know about this. This is the image from Wikipedia.
Yeah, that's it, right? So just zoom in on that, right? So what is that showing? That is showing that World War II actually ended with a signature, not a nuke, right? Like basically the point of the nukes was to get Japan to sign a surrender document, because there were still millions of heavily armed Japanese on the Japanese islands. The point of the nukes was to tell them, hey, you're going to lose. The question is, how much more blood is going to have to be shed before you finally surrender? Do you understand what I'm saying? People only fight unless they think they can win. This broke their willingness to fight because they realized they were just going to get vaporized with bomb after bomb like this.
Isn't this the American strategy with Iran too? Just muscle their way through.
No, it's not. This is the high IQ strategy where there was always a goal of getting documents signed to end a war. And, Bismarck, he has a saying, which is politics, or war is politics by other means, right? Meaning you punch them, but you're constantly offering a document to sign. And as battlefield conditions change and your leverage decreases or increases, those terms become more or less favorable, right? It's a negotiation in a sense where bam, 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 sign this. Bam, bam, bam. Okay, we're going to give you less favorable terms. We're in more of your territory. Okay, fine, we'll do this, right? And, the point is that the other guy is also, like, what is war? War is lose-lose. You're bleeding and they're bleeding, okay? The question is, it's very hard to quote, you can win a war, but really it means lose less, okay? So the thing that has happened over the last few decades is Pentagon and state stop working together. Pentagon would punch them and state would think about, what does the peace look like? What are our actual diplomatic objectives in this war? We want them to just abdicate this peninsula. We want them to, give us access to this resource. We want them to withdraw to the 30th parallel. What is our ask here, right? And then is that ask calibrated to be something that they will do, or do we need to punch them more? Or do we have the power to punch them more? Are they going to punch us back? Do you understand what I'm saying? Right? It's a negotiation. That only happens when you understand that it's like there's a document you want them to sign. And that works when you're dealing with a centralized state. When you're dealing with a centralized state, then there's a guy on their side who can sign a document. After 9/11, because the US was starting to fight decentralized terrorist actors, there wasn't someone who could just sign a document and say, okay, we're standing down. Al-Qaeda had all these cells, each of which would decide to go and blow something up. So even if one guy signed a document saying, okay, I'm not going to blow you up anymore, the other guys would continue to do it, okay? So that began a whole new era where you just had to keep shooting them, and then others would pop up and so on and so forth. But there wasn't someone to negotiate with in the same way, okay? Now, what's happened recently is America has gotten back into interstate conflicts like Ukraine, Russia, or this Iran thing, but they've forgotten how to negotiate. Like, you can see it on the White House feed where they post video games of things blowing up. This is so stupid. Why? Because the whole point is if you want to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, you don't want people thinking there's explosions there. It's like, imagine if you posted videos of things blowing up in New York City and said everything is fine, right? It's so stupid. They genuinely don't understand. They think war is something, this comes back to the bald eagle thing. They think war is something that happens over there that Americans, because they haven't seen American cities get blown up, right? The one thing with 9/11 that happened was this big deal, right? Whereas everybody in the old world has seen their cities getting blown up. So they understand that war isn't a game and that, they take blood and damage for this stuff, right? But now with the Middle East, American targets are getting blown up because unfortunately they're within missile range, right, of the Iranians, right? So this is the first symmetric war where posting these videos of things getting blown up is very stupid because now the Iranians can post videos of American things getting blown up, and they are, right? So including Exxon's thing there in the middle, it's now a symmetric conflict for the first time ever, right? And even if it's not all 300 million Americans that are over there, it's enough billions of dollars to do enormous financial damage to not just America, but all its allies, which in turn does enormous damage to America because it crushes the dollar, right? Basically, for example, one of the things that's happening, China's offering economic reunification to Taiwan on the basis of the fact that it's energy independent, but Taiwan isn't, right? Western Europe is in a much worse negotiating position with Russia because they have now gotten killed by this. Basically, the MAGAs just simply don't understand that by screwing all of their allies or by screwing up and then pretending they meant to, they did something stupid and they pretend it was evil. The stupid is getting the Strait of Hormuz blocked and starting this massive war. They pretend it was just self-interested evil, which is, oh, we meant to screw the Europeans or whatever, right? That's stupid because the Europeans, for example, there's tons of stuff where the Europeans were collaborating with them on tariffs on China and, there's all kinds of goods sent back and forth. So MAGAs are not capable of thinking one step ahead. They really think they've convinced themselves they're Euro poors and they're so poor and so forth. That's a huge source of goods and raw materials and so on for the U.S. Obviously, there's tons of trade there, right? There's lots of friendships there. They're just like destroying all of that for like really no reason whatsoever other than some Twitter dunks. And that's because in many ways, not just the MAGAs, but the wokes, both have inherited something they can never build. And this is a really deep point. Like if you have somebody and there's like a famous, like a Rockefeller kind of entrepreneur, and then they hand down the factory to their son, their grandson, their great-grandson, and so forth. There is legitimacy, right? It has been handed down all the way, okay? But there isn't competency. That is to say, that great-grandson just cashes the checks, but they don't actually know how to operate the factory, let alone build it from scratch. If the factory had to start making a new kind of widget, they wouldn't be able to do it. So when times change, that great-grandson is legitimate but not competent. And then the market shifts away from them and they lose everything, which is what's happening now, right? They've inherited something they can never build. Obviously, if you zoom out from it, nobody would decide to put the financial center of the world and the UN headquarters and all this stuff in the United States as it is now. It's not, as I said, it's not even the United States of America. It's the disunited tribes of North America, right? In this fractious, snarling thing where the Democrats want to drive out all capital and the Republicans want to drive out all talent. Why would you ever base a tech company there? Everything that's there is all trailing indicators. All the tech guys who've been driven out of California, Elon, Zuck, Larry Page, Sergey Brin, Travis Kalanick, right? And then like Bezos leaving Washington State. All of them, that's going to happen probably at a federal level. If Bernie gets his 5% tax through, we'll see what happens, right? But the problem is that the Republicans have made so many enemies abroad for no reason. Not like the Democrats are making friends, but the Republicans are making enemies abroad for no reason. Carney is making friends abroad. Newsom is making friends abroad. They're making friends with China, right? So the whole world is kind of reorganizing. And this one possible scenario is, depending on what happens with this war, it's very possible. Now, like Iran versus Israel is very hard to handicap because they're both smart and they're both they both now think it's existential and they're going to fight really hard against each other. So we don't know what's going to happen there. But there's a scenario where, especially if the U.S. pulls out, which it's likely to do, I think, at some point, especially if like this Marine invasion that they're talking about happening is very poorly thought out, because you send 1,000 Marines, 2,000 Marines there, they're going to take a beachhead. They're not going to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Why? The Iranians will keep shelling them until they're all dead. Duh, right? Like whatever. I mean, I hope that doesn't happen, obviously, but you can't hold a beachhead indefinitely. Like literally you're talking about holding it indefinitely against the entire Iranian military on their home base on soil that they understand, where you're within missile range of everything. Why don't they fire like 1 million missiles every day? Or whatever number of missiles they could, right? It's like the most obvious thing in the world. I don't know. Maybe it's possible. Maybe I'm wrong. Who knows? Okay. But it doesn't seem like it's likely to work. Point being, depending on what happens, it is possible that you actually see greater Iran in the Middle East, or rather the West Asia, right? It's possible Russia dominates North Asia, China dominates East Asia, and India actually is in South Asia. That's very possible that those 4 civilization states kind of carve up Eurasia in this way. And I think in that situation, I think, ASEAN and Australia and New Zealand probably go into the Chinese sphere. Taiwan goes to the Chinese sphere. South Korea may literally be reunified with North Korea by force. Like Kim Jong-un may just decide to go for it because he thinks, they're weak now. I think it's very possible. Japan, China is hard to handicap because, Japan's going to be really weakened by this whole oil cutoff. But they also have been dominant over China for 150 years. On the third hand, China wants to settle scores. China does not want to fight Taiwan, but China wants to fight Japan. So China and Japan would be a really big war. That'd be the third theater in kind of World War III, right? Russia, Ukraine, Iran, Israel, China, Japan. That'd be a big one. India's number one goal is stay out of war, stay out of war, stay out of war, stay out of war, stay out of war. War is bad, right? War blows all kinds of things up. Minimum necessary conflict, maximum feasible diplomacy, and just be chill, basically, right? I think MAGA, after, I think the northern states and the Democrat states will side with Canada and China. I think MAGA turns its attention to Latin America. And so it's Miami, it's Texas, it's also, it's El Salvador, it's Peru with Hernando de Soto, it's Argentina with Milei, it is Venezuela, maybe it's Cuba, it is Suarez, it's Nick Fuentes, it is Francis Suarez of Miami, Nick Fuentes is the podcaster, it's Rubio, it's Bukele, it's all the Latin American leaders, right? Where suddenly there's much more attention in Latin America, partly because so much of the Republicans have gone to Texas and Miami that's kind of like it's in the psyche more. They're thinking about Latin America more, right? It's ironic because, Democrats were supposedly for democracy. By democracy, Democrats meant ruled by Democrats. They're always confused that 50% of the votes go to the Republicans. And when Republicans say America, they mean red America. And they're always confused if 50% of Americans are blue Americans, But what's going to happen, I think, is the Democrats will go to communism, which is Chinese communism, and they'll give up on democracy because what they really want is like a stable bureaucratic job. And the Republicans, MAGA America becomes Latin America. So rather than really stopping the, quote, Latin invasion of America, MAGAs will invade Latin America, which is funny, right? Funny in a historical sense or whatever, right? Like the Venezuela thing is only the beginning. The reason is if they have to withdraw from the Middle East, their pride will be injured and they'll look to knock over a bunch of countries. And Cuba and a bunch of others might be, those are not real countries in the same way that Iran is a real country, China is a real country, right? They don't have the same thousands of years of tradition. They don't have the military sophistication and so on and so forth, right? So
they're not civilizational states.
They're not civilizational states, exactly, right? And the thing about that is, it is something which is sort of obvious for anybody with roots in Asia, but it's not obvious for people with roots in America because on paper, Venezuela and Iran might look the same, but they're just completely different. Whereas one is like this sort of one is an arbitrary administrative boundary for the most part, right? And the other is like, it's got a multi-thousand-year root system.
I get it, but see, for me, and this is just my point of view, considering where the world is right now, I think the problem is the parameters of victory, right? For Iran is just if they make sure the regime survives, they can declare victory. Like for them, the parameter of victory is very different from, let's say, a parameter of victory that would be for the United States of America.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Now, yes, right.
So it's like, the analogy the Pakistani general once gave. Asim Munir, he said, I am a dump truck, India is a Mercedes. So come hit me, you're the Mercedes. I am a dump truck. He literally used on the top of my head, I was like, what a crazy person. Like, what kind of a mindset is this? Like, but a lot of these things are based on the assumption that I think where Americans fell short was that they thought, and I think this is where the diasporas tend to overfeed the American mind, because when you meet the Canadian diaspora, the Iranian diaspora, or the American Iranian diaspora, they are very anti-IRGC, very anti the Ayatollahs, and they took the natural extension being that most of the Iranian people would be like that, and the civilizational state mind is very different. Like, for an outsider, I'll give the Indian example, is for an outsider who looks at India, and you and I have had these conversations offline multiple times where I've said that, an outsider would see, oh, what does a Tamil speaking person got to do with a Punjabi speaking person? They have a lot in common. And
right.
The common only comes out when some outsider comes and pokes us. Otherwise, we're busy fighting each other. But the moment some outsider comes and pokes us, that's when, and it was so obvious when this Operation Sindoor happened, where India had a skirmish with Pakistan, and to the utter surprise, I was talking to Pakistanis and they were horrified and shocked. And their whole critique was, how did all of India come together? We thought we had made these investments and, putting these fault lines, and they don't get it. Like, and I would always tell, a lot of these NRIs and a lot of these Pakistani these that I meet in America, I was like, you don't understand. We are all dharmic. So dharmatizers, whether it's someone speaking Tamil or it's someone speaking Bengali, we are all tied by that culture. And we might be different jatis, we might be different, pantha, like different sects, all of that, but we're all tied by that idea of a civilization. There is no disagreement on that India is a civilization. And that's when you have a common enemy outside your boundaries, it makes things easier. And I think that's something that Persian identity that all Iranians share. They might bicker amongst each other, but you're going to bomb the living daylights out of them. They're not going to like it. And I think, how could America not calculate that was something? I was like, huh?
Well, I think like the best explanation you could give is they're like, wait a second, we have these new weapons and we just did this in Venezuela and it wasn't a problem. And, the Iranians have just done like for show poking at us in the past and they're just going to do some more show this time. But you just went and assassinated their leader. Like, obviously that's like a pretty big deal, right?
Yeah, all bets are off now.
Yeah, and also there was just a war last year, like 9 months ago, and so the thing about this is, there is a grievous miscalculation, I think, on the West. But the issue is it's impossible to address. The reason is they underestimate the East and everything that's non-American. And if you attempt to redress that ignorance by posting graphs, they'll say, oh my God, why are you talking down America? Right. So it's just like this infinite loop, right? Where, and what it means is a lot of, my friends are like, it's like somebody walking into a boxing match and they think the other guy is like some weakling. And so they don't prepare for it or whatever. And suddenly they're in this huge fight that they weren't prepared for, that they may not have chosen if they didn't like. It's this is the Sun Tzu thing, right? It's like if you know yourself and you know the enemy, you'll never lose 1,000 battles. Why? You won't fight unless you can win, right? Another saying is successful generals win first before going to war. Unsuccessful generals go to war first and then expect to win.
Fair enough. What I was surprised with was not the American machismo or the bravado. I'm not saying they're not the strongest military. They are. But I was surprised with the Israelis miscalculating. Because the Israelis are methodical.
Think they're very smart, but I don't think they miscalculated. I actually think that, like, yes, they would prefer a decapitation strike, like the Venezuela thing. If they could have gotten that, they would have taken that. There would have been a win. But, Danny Sutrinowicz is an Israeli analyst, and he said something like, yeah, if we can get decapitation, great. But if Iran is at civil war, like Syria or Libya, that's actually also a win for Israel because then they can't develop a nuclear weapon. But that's a huge L for the Persian diaspora and much of the region, right? So there are obvious disalignments of interest there where what's a win for one group is not necessarily a win for another group. But the issue is, though, like, Iran, rightly or wrongly, the IRGC, they believe that the goal is to push them into civil war, which it was for Syria and Libya. Or whether it's a goal or not, it was a result, right? American policy was just, kill the leader, lots of airstrikes on Gaddafi, and it's in civil war, right? America didn't take any responsibility for that. They didn't care. They were like, guess what? Now Libya's not going to develop nuclear weapons. They're just bombed back to the Stone Age. Let them fight amongst themselves. The Libyans had a horrible decline of their standard of living. NATO bombed them back to the Stone Age. There's this huge refugee crisis. They went to Europe. That's all these problems there, right? So, but yes, they didn't have nuclear weapons, right? True. And so Iran obviously has studied all of these things in the Middle East. And so that's why they're fighting as hard as they are, because they don't want to end up like Libya and Syria and Iraq and, so on and so forth, right? With ISIS and so on. Now, rightly or wrongly, that is their expectation. Maybe everybody would just go off into the sunset. I mean, but some of the things, by the way, that Trump proposed, he was like, oh, well, will the IRGC just melt into the patriots of Iran or something like that, right? And it was like, retarded and romantic in terms of how it was written. One way of putting it, as I explained it to a tech guy, you're not going to stand up a 92 million person app overnight, right? Like, obviously, that just, growth like that doesn't happen. You need to build out the org chart, all this kind of stuff, right? Now imagine building an organization that can run a 92 million person country. That whole org chart has to be set up. It has to have legitimacy. It has to be doing things. It can't just be like, manufactured out of whole cloth, right? It's stress tested in 5,000 ways. And moreover, if you're imposing that on this other regime, guess what? All of those guys, it's as if all their assets were liquidated, all their positions were liquidated, right? Every governor of this and, every mayor of that, every single one of them is being told, you're all fired and here's like the new org chart, right? Look, you've done acquisitions before, I'm sure, right? It basically, a giant org chart a complicated org chart doesn't arise overnight like this, right? When they say the people should rise up, this is just magical thinking. A giant mob doesn't like elect a president and set up, that's something that's done dispassionately. There's many different interests to balance when that happens, right? This kind of belief that, the people will rise up. It's like, Yeltsin, why did he win the post-Soviet contestation? It's because he was backed by the Americans. He got bags of cash to do things, right? So, yeah, I think there's a lot of magical thinking that it's just silly, But the problem is that kind of magical thinking has been indulged, because it's been this giant empire. In fact, it's gotten more unrealistic as it's gotten more in debt and lower IQ and more in decline. One way of looking at that is, look at how much American politicians curse at each other. Obama and Romney, I'm not saying that they were amazing or anything, but the decorum of 2012 was just a completely different situation than 2026. It was a completely different country, right? Go back and look at George H.W. Bush in 1991 and how he spoke and the reserve. That is the kind of guy that you could trust at the center of the world empire. Arguably the last great president was George H.W. Bush, who presided over the end of the Cold War and the peaceful, dissolution of the Soviet Union and so on. Anyway, let me pause there.
Yeah. So before we close, and we'll close now in the last 2-3 minutes, what could be the possible off-ramp for whether Iran or the United States of America, primarily for America? What is the off-ramp for them to stop this?
Iran has stated, and Financial Times has written about this, they've also stated through their spokesman, that they don't want the status quo anymore. But the February 27th status quo is not acceptable. They're just going to keep bombing until, because the reason is they don't think the U.S. will abide by any signed document, because they think the U.S. bombed the negotiation table twice. That's what they've said, right? They killed, basically they killed Khomeini while they were negotiating and so on and so forth, right? So they think, and if you heard the Israeli point of view, they would say, well, obviously the Iranians were lying about their nuclear enrichment. They can't be trusted. We took the opportunity. We took the shot, and so on and so forth. Fine. Okay. Point is that the Iranians have stated that their goal is to reshape the Middle East and to drive the Americans out. This is actually an interesting point. This has been their goal for decades. This is their long-term goal, is to drive the Americans out of the Middle East. And they did out of Iraq and Afghanistan. And they kind of did with the Houthis, using the Houthis in the Red Sea, right? And so what they've now just done is they've imposed massive costs on countries for hosting U.S. military bases. Now, the Iranian national sport is chess, or one of their national sports. They're really into chess. They are into the chess match. So they have calculated these things out. Even Trump said these guys are actually very high IQ. Right? They're finally learning, actually, Persia was Rome's equal. Persia was the USSR to Rome's USA. If you say Iran, then you think some dusty desert country of fundamentalists in caves. Say Persia, okay, that's the peer to Rome. That's a real, ancient superpower, right? And they're not to be underestimated. Anyway, so because of that, you've got two very smart groups that think it's existential, the Israelis and the Iranians, that are going at it. It's very possible that this just ends the Abrahamic era. Like just giant explosions in the Middle East, the oil blows up, that whole region of the world is just something that you just can't rely on at all. Like the holy war in the Middle East, blah, blah, blah. It's literally Abrahamic Armageddon. Very possible that that happens. I hope that doesn't happen, but it's possible that that happens, right? Because Iran is like, look, if you're going to take us out, we're going to blow up everything. They also have what Israel calls the Samson option, right? Basically, in a sense, America, Iran, and Israel are all exercising the Samson option, right? Because Israel feels that Iran tried to take them out, right? With October 7th and Hamas, Houthi says, well, Israel was attacked on three sides. There's a reason the Israelis are so pissed at Iran, right? It's because Iran really, they back these militias that went after them. These guys have been punching each other for a while now. So without litigating all of that, the issue is that a lot of the rest of the world is getting caught in the crossfire, obviously, right? And what one wants to do is just try to stay out of it, A, and then B, get as autarkic as possible, I think, for the critical things. It actually, you know what it is? It's both. As self-sufficient and build as many different trade routes and trade markers. India doing deals with Central Asian countries, anybody who's outside the blast radius, you know what I mean? Southeast Asia, right? And so on and so forth. India should, like pivot to the East or whatever, doing more trade deals with ASEAN and the world at peace and so on, just basically, it's a combination of both self-sufficiency and redirecting trade routes. It's both capitalism and, autarky, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's the only way out, because I don't know what the off-ramp is for both sides. And there's so much damage in terms of physical, real economic damage for the Iranians. They have nothing to lose now. So they're like, we're going down, we're taking the GCC countries down with us. And as far as the Americans are concerned, it's an ego issue for them, right? And when ego, and with a personality like Trump, it does come in between. I don't know what's going to happen in the long run. I think the real losers in this are not Iran and America. The real losers in this are the GCC countries and Europe. And I don't think people are realizing that. But anyways, we'll wrap up. I know it's very late over there for you, but once again, I apologize about that little mess up about the.
Oh, no worries. Hopefully, all good.
And you take care of yourselves, man.
Thank you, sir. Okay, bye.
All right. Take care, Balaji. All right, guys, we'll wrap this up and.